Great. Good morning, everybody, and welcome. Eli Sagor here talking to you from the Cloquet Forestry Center. It's a busy morning here. We've got meetings happening all over the place at the Forestry Center today. And I'm glad to have you on board for this one. So we are here for our regular monthly webinar. Today, as you can see on the screen, we're going to hear from Brian Palik. Brian is one of the PIs, principal investigators on a big national project called Adaptive Silviculture and Climate Change. And we've done a number of programs related to that big project. They have installations all around the country in different forest types, plant communities, different systems. And you've probably heard a fair bit about that. I'm really excited about this one. I approached Brian with this idea of, let's talk about adaptive silviculture, but let's talk about it through a particular lens. Timber production is really an important topic. It's important to many of our land managers, public agencies, and others. It has a whole lot of benefits and important values that it creates for our communities. And let's talk about what we've learned about timber production practices from the adaptive silviculture for climate change projects. Sometimes we see tensions, or wait a minute, I either do adaptation or I do production, or some people may have that view, but I don't think it's like that. So I'm really excited that Brian is here to talk to us about that today. Before we start up, a couple of upcoming events that you should know about. First of all, there's lots of space. To my surprise, there's lots of space in a workshop just over a week from today on this same topic. So anyone who would like, if you are interested in what you hear from Brian over the next hour and you want to dig deeper, we're going to gather next Wednesday, September 28th from 9 to 3 in the Cutfoot Sioux Experimental Forest to explore these sites, to walk through some of these same concepts in the field. So I encourage you to check that out. Again, Wednesday, September 28th, it'll be Brian and me and anyone who cares to join us to talk about these same topics. That registration for that one will be open till noon Friday. So join us if you can. The following day, John Duplessis with NRRI is going to be here at the Forestry Center talking about their forecast modeling platform. That's a brand new platform that they've just published. And we would be happy to welcome folks to that one as well. What else do we have coming up? There's an event in Ely, October 12th and 13th is going to be a really good one about the Pagami Creek fire, lessons learned, 10 years. It's actually 12 years on now. And that'll be a great event up in Ely, October 12th and 13th. Next month's webinar is breaking the mold just a little bit with a conversation about communicating silviculture. It's really going to be fun. We've got Mike Reinikainen from Minnesota DNR, Brad Hutnick, one of his counterparts from Wisconsin, and Ryan Murphy, who's with the University of Minnesota, urban forestry guy. Some of you may know Ryan, really an interesting guy. Lane will be moderating a conversation about how we communicate about silviculture. So we want to hear from you in that one before and during about how you receive information about silviculture, how you'd like to receive it, what we can do in terms of communication to better reach and engage you or people like you, or maybe other groups that maybe we need to reach out to a little bit more. Again, Communicating Silviculture, October 18th, just about a month from today. I did put upcoming events in the chat. I welcome you to check that out and join us for one of those. Again, any questions for Brian, submit them anytime. He'll be pausing throughout, or I'll interrupt him if need be, if there's something urgent. But we'll do most of the Q&A at the end, but I encourage you to add your questions at any time. And Brian, I said that was going to be a really short preamble, and it ended up pretty long, but I'll be quiet now and hand the screen to you. Really happy to have Brian Palik with the Northern Research Station here today. Brian, you're on.
Okay, thanks, Eli. So as Eli said, what I'm going to talk about is some of our thoughts and work on climate change adaptation. But what I tried to do, which I don't normally always do, is put more of a timber production spin on this. So a little more specifically, we'll just look at, and probably most of this will be review, but thinking about what is happening with climate change that affects timber production. And we usually think about that in a negative way, but there's some potentially positive things as well. And then we'll focus on how you adapt to those changes and still grow timber. So let's start with this. So a little bit on what's happening with climate change. What this shows are observed and projected temperature changes in Minnesota. Now you can see on the left, those are observed, and there's, it's pretty wavy line, but there's a general trend toward increasing mean annual temperature. And then you see those projections, both with a high emission scenario and a lower emission scenario, and they're pretty extreme in terms of what is predicted to happen. This is for more specifically northeastern Minnesota in the Arrowhead region, and again under a high emission scenario. And so pretty large annual increase in average annual temperature and average summer temperature by the end of the century. And, people talk about what's going to happen, but I just point out that some of this has already happened. And what you see on the right, this is a Minnesota map, but it comes out of a continental US projection or representation of mean annual temperature increases that have already happened. And that part of Minnesota, where we're based, is one of the hot spots of temperature change in the lower 48 states. There's 6 or 7 of those spots, and we're one of them. So over 5-degree Fahrenheit increase over the last 100 or so years. And we know that that's accurate, at least for our case, because we maintain the weather station in Grand Rapids that's pointing to. Another thing that happens, when we have those kinds of temperature increases is growing season length changes. And you probably know this, in the last, 40 years, we've had a fairly large increase in growing season in Minnesota. And again, there's the prediction from the vulnerability assessment by the end of the century, potentially up to a 70-day increase. That's a lot. And so, that's not necessarily a bad thing in terms of growing trees, although there's a host of other issues that come into play. Here's just the projections for the lake states in general. And so it's showing the changes in last frost dates in the spring, first frost in the autumn. And then that bottom frame is that growing season length projection. So it's pretty consistent in terms of different sources, what they're saying is happening and is going to happen. Here's precipitation, the other big thing that people focus on. And this is observed annual precip in Minnesota again. And again, lines are wavy, but it's the trend line is increasing somewhat in terms of average annual precipitation through, this is like 8 years old now. And you see those numbers on the top. So there hasn't been a big change, but in general, some increase. There's a prediction for the Arrowhead region, again, northeastern Minnesota. And it's not a big change in average annual precip by the end of the century under a high emission scenario. So, there's some thought that Minnesota, as an example, is getting wetter. But we need to think about the seasonality of those changes. So the prediction for northeastern Minnesota in particular is a decrease in average summer precip by almost 5 inches, again, under a high emission scenario. If you combine that with the predicted change in average summer temperature, what we're looking at is potential for increasing summer drought, frequency, severity, and intensity. And along with that, then soil moisture deficits. So that's actually what this shows, again, from the vulnerability assessment. This is the ratio of evapotranspiration to precip. And that area I have circled there in Minnesota that's red is a decline in that ratio. So it's becoming drier in terms of soil moisture availability. And those kinds of numbers, that ratio, precip temperature, is what leads to that graphic on the right, which you've probably all seen, Kansas or Minnesota turning into Kansas in the summer. And it's based on that kind of information. So what's behind those changes, which are, the kind of standard things that people think about? And as you know, it's increasing atmospheric carbon dioxide and methane. And the CO2 part of this has been really well documented and reconstructed back into, way into the past. And you see that in that graphic there, that steady increase. And most of that increase has happened in the last, 50 years or so, which you see on the right of that. So, one thing that people talk about relative to growing trees or plants in general is that necessarily a bad thing? Because essentially CO2 in the atmosphere is fertilizing the atmosphere. So people talk about CO2 enrichment. And what about that? You need to go back to your basic understanding of photosynthesis. It's carbon dioxide plus water vapor, or excuse me, plus water generates through photosynthesis carbohydrates and releases oxygen. So in theory, more CO2 in the atmosphere, greater concentration, may lead to more rapid rates of photosynthesis. So the idea here is that CO2 enrichment may be making trees grow faster. And if you've ever looked into the literature on this, it's maybe or maybe not. It depends on the species, the forest, the length of time that people look at this. And in general, there may be an increase initially, but other factors then begin to develop and become issues, like soil resources become limiting, water in particular. And also trees tend to die faster when they're growing faster. So everything is speeded up. So it's not necessarily going to be a good thing in the longer term. So what does all this mean in terms of the real and predicted changes relative to trees and forests and growing timber? Well, in general, I think the feeling is that maybe it's not going to be all good. At least that's kind of the focus we hear from people, including me mostly. So for example, there's this prediction of changes in biome distribution in Minnesota. On the left, this is actually, if you saw that CO2 graph or looked at it, we're at about 422 parts per million now. And the expectation is it goes up into the 600s by, the end of the century. But currently, most of Minnesota is forest compatible. And the projection for 50 years from now is that most of it's going to be prairie biome. Not that we'll have prairie all over the place, but the climate will be such that it would support a prairie biome under that kind of emission scenario. And so trying to advance here. So potentially a lot of forest habitat loss, but you probably know that not all models show that. And one of the ones that people use a lot is Tree Atlas. It's a Forest Service product. It's available on the web. It's for Eastern US tree species. They're on version 4 now. And so what I'm showing here, this is for the Minnesota Drift and Lake Plain subsection, those species that probably people are most interested in terms of managing for timber. Under the 2 emission pathways, the 4.5 and the 8.5, so lower and higher. And most of these have some small decreases in habitat suitability, but some no change and 1 or 2 increases. You have to think about that also with adaptability. And some of these are low, so we'll look at red pine, why that is in a minute, but no change in habitat suitability currently under even a high emission scenario, but a low adaptability. So there's other things going on. There's the same species, the same kind of predictions in the superior upland subsection. So most of these are in the decreasing category in terms of potential habitat suitability. So the flip side of this are potential for species to increase in importance. So again, drift and lake plains on the left there. And these are species that most of them, well, they're all considered native for that section, although some of them are, pretty sporadic in terms of finding them there. But pretty much all increasing habitat suitability and generally high adaptability. And then there's the same suite, if I can get it to advance, there we go, for the superior uplands. So pretty much all of them are large increases in habitat suitability, high adaptability for a number of them. And then a couple of new species that aren't currently in that subsection, white oak and bitternut hickory. So the point of this is that the projections are potential for pretty big changes based on that modeling, in particular, these new species or lower abundant species increasing in habitat suitability. One of the things I think you need to keep in mind with that modeling is Habitat suitability modeling is just climate envelope modeling. So it's looking at what the climate is now, where a species is, and what it's going to be like somewhere else in the future, and are they compatible? But there's more things going on, and it has to do with that adaptability index. And red pine is a good example of this. So both of those climate pathways show, this is for the drift and lake plain subsection, show no change in habitat suitability. But adaptability is low. And one of the reasons for that is we think of red pine as being a dry site species, but it's really susceptible to drought. Its growth is. It's affected negatively by that. And we know that. We've done quite a bit of work on this over the years. So what this is showing on the left is Palmer Drought Severity Index. And you can see those arrows are severe droughts that are more than -2 on that index. And then on the right, this is from a stand on the Superior National Forest. You can see the relationship between basal area increment of the whole stand and those droughts. So it's a pretty much one-to-one correspondence between severe drought and reduction in growth. So the concern is then with this increasing summer drought frequency and severity with soil moisture deficits developing, that there's going to be an impact to growth for species on drought-prone soils, even if a model like Tree Atlas shows no big change in habitat suitability over time. So there's just more going on the ground than those models can accommodate. So the point of all this is that climate's changing ways that will impact forests and your ability to grow timber on them. And the question then that we'll turn to now is, can you adapt and still grow timber? And the answer is yes, maybe, and it depends, as you'll see. So I'm trying to get my slide to advance. Eli, there we go. We think about this, and probably a few of you have seen this before, using this framework of resistance, resilience, and transition. And the idea here, these are gradients of potential impacts to a forest from climate change, and then what you might do relative to silviculture on the ground to either maintain current conditions or promote change. And I kind of think about them like this. So resistance, as you'll see, is pretty easy to do. It's low risk and you know how to do it. Resilience might be a little harder, and maybe if your focus is on timber species, you're not necessarily working within more of a range of your natural range of variability for the ecosystem, but it's probably possible, and you should know how to do it. And then transition is something higher risk and a little bit longer term because it usually involves assisted migration of species or genotypes. So you might need some convincing to try that. But we're going to look at that, and we're going to use red pine as kind of a model system for thinking about it, because that's where we do most of our work. And more broadly, it's really this dry mesic mixed species woodland that we tend to grow red pine on. So here's the characteristics that this is just generalized, for Minnesota, for the northern Lake States, and there's a range of different ecosystems that have red pine, but a number of them have these characteristics: mixed severity fire regime, including less than stand replacing fire. We've learned that over the last 20, 30 years that stand replacing fire was not the norm, and a lot of people have shown that across the Lake States. Openings from other disturbance events like armillaria and wind were important for kind of patch scale openings. Complex and variable age structures, mixed species composition, and woodlands with variable canopy cover. Some people talk about closed woodlands, just sort of you would think an oxymoron, but not necessarily a real open thing, but still lower basal area stocking. And it's just an example, if you know Minnesota's classification, community classification, there's FDN 33A, there's 12 species of trees in there. And yeah, red pine may be dominant, but cumulatively the other species are going to be more important. And you know how we manage for red pine: even age stands, single age stands, spatially homogeneous in structure, high stocking, if you know stocking charts favoring the A line, generally short rotations relative to the lifespan of red pine and white pine, strongly red pine dominated because it's an important timber species, and even age regeneration systems. And I would argue that's a climate change vulnerable condition. So what we want to think about is how do we adapt and maintain productivity? And we use that that resistance, resilience, transition framework. And we do this, we're testing science ideas, but we're trying to demonstrate this on the ground. Probably a few of you have been there, using our adaptive silviculture for climate change experiment that Eli talked about. We call ours Red Pine Ask. It's on the Cuthwood Experimental Forest. It's pretty big. You see the air photo of the installation there. So 4 treatments, including a passive, do nothing and see what happens, and then a resistance resilience transition that we'll look at. And it was a pretty big timber sale, big units, and large harvest and a lot of planting. And again, just remember the current condition, which I'm not really going to get into here, but largely these are even age stands. They were naturally regenerated, but after a big fire, so single cohort, simple structure, spatially homogeneous, high stocking, about 200 square feet per acre on average, and strongly red pine dominated. So let's look at resistance first and what we're doing there. So resistance, recall, is to reduce impacts, at least in the short term, and maintain current conditions, at least in the shorter term. So we want to maintain red pine dominance, most of the basal area. And what we've done in our take on this is thinning. And we hit 120 square feet with our thinning in the first entry. And there's a second entry plan that will get down to 90, and you'll see why in a second here. And that treatment for us doesn't have any targeted regeneration activities. It doesn't mean you can't, but it's not the goal here. The goal is to think about how you use density management to mitigate drought. So you think about why you thin. You thin to increase resource availability to the remaining trees, which improves their vigor and increases growth. And you know how to do that. It's pretty simple. We do it. Well, it's really that concept, but what you're trying to enhance availability of is soil moisture. And so there's an optimal stocking likely that increases drought, resistance, and resilience. We'll look at what those are in a second here. But also maintain productivity of that site. And that the goal is, if you can see the colors here, they don't show up that well on my screen, but the light blue is a zone of low vulnerability to drought. So you're trying to maintain stocking within that zone. Does it work? Well, it does. And here's how we know it does. We know by our work on red pine growing stock studies. And there's a couple of them that we focus on, one on Superior National Forest, one on Chippewa. And these are periodically thinned to maintain a range of target basal areas. And now what we've done is gone back and cored the trees and looked at ring widths and converted those to tree basal area and then scaled to stand. So what I'm going to show you is all stand level response. And we relate that growth to past drought events. We use kind of 2 unitless measures here. One is resistance, basal area increment during a drought compared to before, and then resilience after the drought compared to before. So kind of a recovery metric. Here's the Birch Lake Plantation. This plantation planted on Superior National Forest, established in 57 in 45-year-old stands. There's uncut control, which is around 220 square feet. And then those levels of thinning, which have been maintained through thinning over time, 4 times so far. And we've published on growth responses to this. So what you're seeing here, I'm going to apologize, I'm mixing up metric units of the response, volume growth, and basal area stocking is English, just probably relate to that better. But it's just kind of a relative comparison. So this shows the stocking levels and stem volume growth per year. And we also have looked at thinning from above versus below. And so the solid lines, it's dominant thinning from above, and the dashed are thinning from below. There's some differences, but the main focus here that you should look at is that 30 square feet basal area is probably understocked from a productivity standpoint, not surprisingly. So here's resistance. Again, growth during the drought compared to before. And what this shows is a depression of growth. The one line is no change. So if you're below it, you're growing slower. And before there was any thinning during that 48 drought, all the future treatments had growth depression. But after one thinning in that 61 drought on the right, you can see that those lower stocking levels actually had increased growth. And then the 90 was really no change. And then what happened after 4 thinnings, the 88 drought on the bottom there, is they were all depressed in terms of their growth, including the lowest stocking, but it's that kind of mid-range of 90 to 120 that at least relatively has the higher resistance. So the idea is there that moderate stocking maintains still fully stocked stands, if you go back to that previous slide. And what we think is happening over time at those low stockings is those trees become vulnerable. Physiological burden develops with those really large crowns at the low stocking that reduce their growth potential. So there's that. Resilience is pretty much the same pattern. So this is growth after the drought compared to before. So same trends as resistance before thinning, and then early on, higher resilience at low to moderate stocking, and then longer term stands had higher resilience at moderate stocking. So that 90, 100, and again, understocked develops low resilience eventually. So that's Birch Lake. Now just look briefly at our stocking level study on the Chippewa National Forest. So these are natural origin stands established in 1950, the study, and they were 85 years old at the time. Some of you have seen these. So there's the range of stockings we maintain. There's no control in this. And thinned 6 to 8 times. And just like Birch Lake, we've looked at and published on growth responses. There's quadratic mean diameter. The red lines are when they were thinned. There's net cumulative volume growth. So even at old age, the trees are growing, the stands are growing. There's periodic annual increment and mean annual increment, the means over time. And the bottom, you see that conversion from metric to English stocking levels. And the point here is that that lowest stocking, the 60 square feet, is probably understocked from a productivity standpoint. So we're getting, it has good, as you'll see, resilience and resistance response, but it's not fully occupying the site. So here's resilience and resistance for this study. 2 droughts, 1956 and 2006. And this is framed as stand density index, but you can see the stocking levels from 60 to 140. And then we looked at 100, I guess it was in between. And the lines are negative. So the idea here is that resistance and resilience for both droughts decreased with stocking level. So more stocking, less resistance, resilience. The highest resistance and resilience was probably below the B line. And so productivity is reduced because the site isn't fully occupied. But that moderate stocking right around the B line may represent the best compromise between drought mitigation and productivity. And that trend is true for both those younger Birch Lake stands and these older cutfoot stands show that pattern. And I tell you that I'm not showing this, but we've looked at this in Ponderosa Pine, a couple of sites out west, exactly the same thing, even stronger because they tend to be droughtier. And then we're now looking at white spruce thinning trials on both Superior and Chippewa with this in mind. So the idea here is resistance is if you implement it with thinning, you can reduce that negative drought impact on those drought-prone soils. So now let's look at resilience. It's a little bit harder. You're trying to work within the natural system, but favor composition structure that are more climate adapted. So mitigating impacts in the midterm adapting. And what we've done is reduce red pine basal area to about 1/2 to 3/4. We're focusing on native future adapted species. So they're part of that ecosystem. And we've used a variable density thinning approach, which is gaps, skips, and thinning in between, just like the resistance treatment. And our regeneration activity, which is artificial planting, is focused on the gaps themselves. And you see in that picture in the background is a gap. So keep in mind the characteristics of the native ecosystem. There's complex structures, openings, mixed species, woodlands. Really what we're trying to do with this approach is get these back to that, short of having fire like we should in these systems. That hasn't been happening, but structurally. Those are the species that we planted in this resilience treatment. The 4 on the bottom are all predicted to have increasing habitat suitability. And you can see where the seed sources are from. They're native species, but they're somewhat more southern seed sources. Jack pine is actually predicted to have a small decrease in habitat suitability, but just talking with foresters and experts around the region, the thought that the modeling for that probably isn't quite right. The jack pine should do okay into a drier future. So we've included that. The idea here is, you're kind of mixing up the dominant species in the overstory over time. So you might be focusing on red pine and regenerating other things, and later on you might leave white pine and regenerating these other species. But it's within the range of variability for the ecosystem. And the question would be then, does it work? Well, we have a lot of research and published results on complex structure in red pine dominated forests and then pine regeneration. Some of you have probably been to our red pine retention study on the Chippewa National Forest, where we just kind of mixed up the spatial pattern of the overstory and created these different structural conditions. And then we have planted these stands a long time ago now with the 3 native pines. And what this shows is white pine survival over time on the left and jack pine on the right in these different treatments. And it's not just the gaps that have been planted, it's whole stands here. And then the top is with shrubs present, it's mostly hazel. Present means ambient levels, and then absent actually is reduced. You can't really get rid of it all, but more or less. And you can see that white pine doesn't care. It really survives well over long periods of time, regardless of the spatial structure of the stand. Jack pine, not surprisingly, has low survival in uncut forests, that lowest line. But if you remove hazel, it actually, survival is not all that different than the partial harvests there. So it really makes a difference, that competition in the understory. So the whole idea here is that we need to be thinking about managing from a mix of commercial species, not just red pine in this example. So let's look at transition last. So again, higher risk, might need convincing to do this because it involves assisted migration. And what you're trying to do is you're accepting that changes are occurring, and you actually work to facilitate those changes. So what we've done in our installation is reduce red pine basal area a lot, down to maybe 25% currently, and we're working on increasing abundance of future adapted species, both native and novel. And we've used a regular shelter wood to do this, expanding gap of regular shelter wood. And we haven't expanded our gaps yet, but there is a second entry plan to do that. And roughly 20% of the stand areas and gaps, and then thinned in between, but thinning to a lower level than in the other 2 treatments. And then we've planted future adapted species stand-wide, both native and novel. And here's the mix of them. So some of the same species from the resilience treatment in black. Notice the seed sources again. They're not from local. They're actually from the next southern climate zone for those top 3. White pine is wherever everybody's getting blister rust tolerant seed sources from. And then the 4 bottom are in red are predicted to have habitat increases in the region. We'll talk about why ponderosa pine in a minute. That's a little different. But the other 3 are hardwoods from southeastern central Minnesota, and you can see where the seed sources came from. And white black cherry is actually in that area, in that ecosystem, but it's really sporadic. So why that approach? Well, it's aimed at adapting to end of century predictions. And the stands so far have a range of microclimate environments. And then we've included system migration of both species and genotypes. And the goal is to kind of push back on that idea that prairie is taken over Minnesota. So keeping forests on the landscape in the long term by promoting these species that may do well. So what do we know so far? It's a pretty new study, started in 2014. This is 5th-year survival in the transition treatment. And you can see the species array at the top there, and then what they're called on the bottom, x-axis. Again, red, the whole species have been moved, and then black is the genotypes have been moved. And I guess the thing to note there is that the hardwood species towards the left, from black cherry leftward, have really high survival. And we're, I think, in year 7 now, and they appear to be doing just as well. So in some cases, near 100%. White pine, not bad, 75%. There's the ponderosa pine on the right. So what we have are 4 different seed sources there based on a long-term provenance trial in Minnesota that the University of Minnesota has conducted. So pretty low survival overall, and we don't think it's a maladaptation thing. They don't tolerate competition from hazel, raspberry, big leaf aster. So the idea there was just to look at another long-needled, fire-dependent pine that may do well in a drier climate. And it's, again, we're not advocating planting it, we're just examining it. So the point of that arrow is that, and this shouldn't surprise you if you're a gardener, and you look at changes in our climate zones, that aspects of climate for these more southern species is already in northern Minnesota and has been for 20 years. So I'm not really surprised by that. There's growth. This is relative growth, diameter growth. You can't compare these directly because different stock sizes, stock type, et cetera. And the ponderosa pine grows the best. When it survives, it has the highest growth rate. And then the hardwoods, as you know, hardwoods develop their root systems below ground allocation first, and they take off. So I think that's what we're seeing there. We don't just fixate on or focus on artificial regeneration. We also have been looking at natural regeneration in these treatments. And you see that here on the left. This is a relative adaptability score, something that NIAX has put together for species. And you kind of sum all the species up and get the stands adaptability score, and transition is higher than all the rest. And it's mostly because of more bur oak, red maple, red oak, white pine. And it's not just that it's higher now, but maybe was before treatment. It's a legitimate change after treatment. So you see on the right, the relative adaptability change. And so it's a true increase. And so it's something to think about doing if you want. With this kind of treatment, just recall, it's a regular shelter wood. We had site preparation with it's the Chippewa harrowing system, the mineral soil furrows that get turned up, break up hazel roots, and a shrub reduction. So what about somewhat longer term responses? This is new enough that I can't say much about, empirical data, but we use FVS to look at some things. So what this is showing is tree composition changes about 100 years down the road. Of the 4 treatments, notice the no action, the resistance, mostly no change. So red pine now and red pine later based on that modeling. Resilience is start to see some of these other species come in and increase importance. And then transition is where the big changes occur. So by 100 years roughly or so, I do think my year graphic is off. It says 2116. That's right. About 100 years from now, you can see those other species coming in importance. And the thing to think about here relative to timber is, what are the trees of the future going to be? And heaven forbid it's red maple, like on the top there, but it's everywhere in the eastern US. It's hard to get rid of, and it does well under such a wide range of conditions that it's going to be hard to not think about utilizing it in some way. And then the lower is black cherry. This is actually a couple slides that John Ryla from Ryla Company sent me, timber company in northern Minnesota. And if they can find black cherry, they welcome it for specialty products. And if there's more in the future, that would be good as well. So the point is that what is considered a timber species now may not be in the future. And what isn't now may be in the future. Here's productivity. Last thing I think I'll show here is we do predict this with FVS. So on the left is mean annual increment. And you can see over time, and the transition treatment starts out relatively low because there isn't a lot of growing stock initially, but eventually these converge in terms of their mean annual increment. And then on the right, it's pretty interesting. This is prediction of tree mortality. You can see most of them increase, but that transition treatment has really low mortality relative to the other treatments and really low variability in the different time periods of mortality. So it's just reflecting on how well those trees are likely to do in the future. So I'm going to just summarize here and point out some things. So what I've tried to convince you is that climate change is going to have large impacts. You know this, you've heard it, on habitat suitability, but also growing conditions for trees and forests in northern Minnesota. And many currently important commercial species may be vulnerable. It may not be just their habitat suitability is changing, but their growth in different conditions, depending on the species and where you're at. On the other hand, we don't hear enough about this, I don't think. There will be opportunities for establishment of new species of commercial importance if you keep an open mind about it. There's also silvicultural actions that can be used to mitigate impacts, at least in the near to midterm. So, we talked about resistance, it's thinning, density management to increase drought adaptation. Despite the thought that annual precip is not changing or likely to increase, I think it's that summer precip that might induce this kind of a concern, and that you can mitigate and maintain the growth and health of those trees. And then resilience is to manage for adapted native species. So working with what you have, but keep in mind that what you have down the road may not be the current timber tree of the day. Then transition, which because it involves system migration is higher risk, and timber management is generally risk adverse. But the story that we talk about, it may be riskier to do nothing now because forests take a long time to develop. So we need to be thinking about this. Let's see here. So what I've tried to do is give you a range of options in that example forest type or combinations of them. It's not just these 3 bins, but you could think about combining them, and hopefully it gives you something to think about, something to try, but importantly, something to defend why you're doing it and defending what you're doing to your bosses, your organizations, your stakeholders. And then I guess the last thing I would just say, if I can, there we go, is Eli mentioned that our work is part of this broader network of adaptive silviculture for climate change. And there's the website for it. You can see there's actually sites all over the country and several in Canada now. So ours was the first, but there's more out there. And then, so I've been saying these things, but I showed aspects of research that all of these people have been involved in. And if I said anything useful, probably they thought of it and said it first. So with that, Eli, I think I'm done. And if there's questions, we can do that.
Thanks, Brian. It's great. We do have a few questions here. It's funny, my view just changed a moment ago, so I had to adjust a bit. First question is from way up on the Grand Portage area. You mentioned white spruce thinning trials. What do you use for a thinning guide for white spruce? Have there been any improvements on the 2000 Saunders and Putman Lake States DMD?
So yeah, I should know the details of this, but I don't. We're not looking at it as from that standpoint as trying to improve on those guides like that one. It's just long-term thinning trials with installations on both Superior and the Chippewa that with Sam Jones at the Bemidji State, she's reconstructing the growth histories of trees in those trials. And I don't know what we're going to see yet, but they're old studies. So they would have been based on something a lot older and before the reference you mentioned.
Great. And then a related question, and I'll invite others to submit questions too. I got a couple of others here, but from the same person, if we start doing mixed species resilience plantations, and I know for spruce, there is reason to think that might be a good idea. What should we use for thinning guides for those mixed species plantations? That's a tough one.
Yeah, well, it is good. And, we don't usually think about mixed species plantations. And I don't know that there are, some of the people in the audience will know this better than me, but I don't know that there are any good thinning guides for those settings. And this is a kind of a cop out, but we tend not to think about that in that way because we're largely not worried about getting those kinds of numbers in terms of mixed species and thinning response to it. I don't want to downplay the question. It's a really good one, but I don't know that I have the answer.
Yeah, that's those answers are hard to come by because the density management diagrams and other things are done on single species and it's often old data. There are some sort of hazards with using those. But there are, I guess my thought would be, if I can add to Brian's, really good. That was Matt Petz-Jaguar that asked those questions. And there's really good silvicultural guidance. I was out in the woods at an SFEC workshop last week with a number of other people, with Ashley Lenner with DNR's ECS program. And their silvicultural guidance grounded in native plant communities has gotten quite a bit more detailed. And so, Matt, that's another resource that it's not going to directly answer your question. I realize that, just like Brian said, but that might give you some guidance in terms of how to think about mixing up spruce plantations, what species might coexist and thrive with spruce. And according to, I've heard Sawyer Scherer and Cheryl Adams before him, and others with Blandon. I don't know if we've got anyone from Blandon on today, but they have found that higher growth rates in both spruce and aspen when they mix them. And that was part of what I was referring to when I said earlier that might not be a bad idea, but still not sure there's a great guide for exactly what you're looking for. Brian, a question that occurred to me when you mentioned a term called relative adaptability that NIACS had developed, and you showed a couple of charts for that as you were discussing transition. I didn't understand that term, and I wonder if you might explain it a little bit further. What was unclear to me was why a species would become more adaptable. Adaptability seems to me that it would be inherent to a species, or maybe a particular population of a species, rather than responsive to a treatment. And if I understood you right, it was just natural. You were talking about natural regeneration after the treatments. Did I miss something? I probably did, but can you explain that further?
Yeah, so I can't point you to the exact location on NIAC's website, but if people go to their website, you can find these ratings, and there's species adaptability indices. And then what you're doing is just tallying up how much of each species you have in a treatment. So it's not that the treatments are changing adaptability. It's just the composition is such that the overall score is higher in that transition treatment because there's more higher adapted species with a higher index of adaptability. And it's coming out in Forest Ecology and Management. In fact, it's online now. The paper on this that we put out on this natural regeneration, so people could look at that.
Great. And Brian, if you want to help me find that or send me that link, I would be happy to, not that you would necessarily have it right at your fingertips now, but I would be happy to send that out to folks afterwards. So I'm fumbling just a little because I know I'm without Lane here, and I want to make sure that we are able to post. I want to give you the web, continuing education credit request form, and I'm not seeing it immediately, which is unfortunate. Thought I knew what it was, but I'm not seeing it. In any case, I'll find that here in a moment, but we do have time for a couple more questions. There's one. Brian, are there any studies that show the increase in growth rates due to additional CO2, or is that just an assumption?
No, there are studies that show that. And from different regions and different forest types. So it does happen, but it tends to be a short, and I'm sure that the FACE installation that Michigan Tech had was out of Rhinelander, I guess. And I don't know if, I think it's been dismantled. So that was with aspen. I'm sure that they showed that, but it tends to be just before, last week I was poking around at some of the literature on this, and it tends to be kind of a short-lived thing, like maybe 10 years, and then other things become limiting. If you think about it, higher CO2 might be an enrichment, but if at the same time during the growing season there's lower soil moisture availability on dry sites, if that's what happens, then stomata close and you don't get that enhancement of CO2. So it just, other things start to become limiting, but it has been shown. And I would guess that maybe the jury is a little bit still out on the long-term thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a complex relationship, and the being able to take advantage of higher CO2 requires opening stomates, which can make trees more vulnerable to drought. You discussed that change in precip patterns, Brian, and so it's a complicated thing. So I'm not seeing any more questions right now. I will invite folks to continue to post them if you have them and are just being shy. But while we're waiting for that, a couple of quick things. One, a reminder that we will be in the field talking about these same concepts and visiting some of the sites that Brian mentioned. I've just put the upcoming events link in there. It looks like that's going to be a small group. I had thought we might have a larger group register in advance, but there's plenty of room there and we'd love to have you join us. So if you are interested in joining us next Wednesday in the field to dig more deeply into these topics, click that upcoming events link and you can register there. And I was fumbling around earlier, but I did find the continuing education credit link, and I have added that to the chat. So you'll see that in the chat. That's right there. And Casey asked, Brian, we do have another question here. Casey asks, do the studies, I assume, about the relationship between higher CO2 and growth, did they account for increased pests, maybe associated with warmer conditions?
Yeah, if that's what the question's referring to, I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if somebody hasn't looked at that in that setting, but I couldn't say for sure if it's related to that CO2 increase question.
Yeah, one of those studies, and Brian, you may have been referring to other studies too, but I know that the Be Forewarned project, which is here at the Cloquet Forestry Center and at the Hubachek Wilderness Research Center in Ely, found that, yeah, there is higher growth, but as I was saying before, it's related, and as you pointed out, it can be constrained by a number of things, certainly higher pest activity and changing, more increased vulnerability to drought and a number of other things. So, yeah, there's nothing certain in biology, and it's hard to know. I'm not seeing any more questions right now. So Brian, I'll thank you. I sure hope to see you in the woods in a week for the field session associated with today. I want to thank folks for turning out. This was a really good talk, and I hope it gave you a few ideas that you can integrate into your management wherever you are around the state or beyond. If you have questions, feel free to email me or Lane Mosier. And we hope to see you at an event coming up soon. We will have this recording posted to the event website sometime later this week. It may take a little bit longer than normal due to some things that are going on here with SFEC and travel and other things, but we'll get it up there soon, and encourage you to share it with anyone you'd like. Brian, thank you very much. Good to see you this morning, and I appreciate your presentation, and thanks everyone for coming.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.